I haven't heard a thing from the White House. Not a thing since the debate. And I represent, a member of the congressional delegation to a critical state for Joe Biden, Virginia. I think most of my colleagues, like myself, are processing what happened. And we don't want to make decisions in haste or in panic. Joe Biden is a consequential president. He's been a friend of mine. And in fact, I worked for him for 10 years. I've known him for 45. I'm not going to jettison Joe Biden based on a 90-minute debate. But I do want to be reassured that Joe Biden is capable of doing the job, wants to do the job, and that he can reassure the public to both of those things.
That was Democratic Congressman Jerry Connolly of Virginia expressing some frustration over the lack of communication from the White House following last week's debate. Joining us now, senior advisor and senior spokesperson for the Biden-Harris 2024 re-election campaign, Adrienne Elrod. So, Adrienne, we've been talking a lot about it this morning. A lot of people are really concerned about President Biden and whether or not he should stay in the race. We just heard from Tim Ryan. And Tim Ryan bluntly put it out there. He worries Joe Biden cannot deliver. He says Americans needed to see a candidate punching back at Trump's lies, repeated lies over the course of 90 minutes. And over the course of 90 minutes, he repeatedly struck out even on basic issues like abortion and some of the basic arguments of our time. To that, you say what? To the calls from people like Tim Ryan to shake up the race, what do you say?
Well, a couple of things, Mika. First of all, good morning. Secondly, look, President Biden has made it very clear. How many times does he have to say it, that he did not have his best night? He said it at a fundraiser last night in McLean, Virginia, that he was tired. You've noted on the show, Mika, many times that, he traveled twice around the world. He was exhausted. He did not have his best night. However, I don't know if Congressman Ryan saw this, but President Biden gave a rousing speech in North Carolina the next morning where he did make that contrast, where he did talk about the fundamentals of this race, what is at stake for the American people. He talked about the 50 lies that Donald Trump told on that debate stage. He talked about the fact that Donald Trump lied about women's reproductive rights. He lied about January 6th. He lied about the economy. He lied about a number of things. He has also said, Mika, and President Biden reminds us of this all the time, that Donald Trump has said, in his own words, that he would lead as a dictator on day one in this country. That is incredibly dangerous. We saw, of course, the Supreme Court's incredibly toxic ruling that they made earlier this week on presidential immunity. You heard President Biden, being presidential, speaking from the White House about what's at stake and how dangerous the Supreme Court ruling is. We have a Supreme Court that is constantly ruling 6-3, largely against the American people. Why? Because Donald Trump put 3 Supreme Court justices on the court. The next president of the United States, Mika, could also put potentially 2 more Supreme Court justices on. So you're going to see President Biden out there making that contrast. He's meeting with governors today. He's traveling to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania this weekend. He's doing a number of things. He's being the president of the United States. He's doing his job. He's going to continue to reassure the American people that he's up for the job. He's speaking to George Stephanopoulos, doing an interview on Friday that will air this Sunday. He is out there doing what he needs to do to reassure the American people. But, Mika, he's also going out and talking to voters directly. And voters in this election will ultimately decide. We have seen from our internal polling that there has not been much of a shift. We have seen in 8 public polls that this race remains within the margin of error and that this debate did not shift really at all in these polls. So I think it's important for everyone to take a step back, take a beat, realize President Biden is the only person in this country who has defeated Donald Trump, and he will also defeat him again in November.
So there are those who are, even you heard Jerry Connolly there saying they haven't heard from President Biden. And they want to be reassured. Your words sound reassuring. With due respect, I think people want to hear those words from President Biden himself, especially top Democrats who are sort of waiting to see what happened and to hear from him personally.
Yeah, look, I think he's making calls. It's been reported that he's making calls to congressional members. I can certainly confirm that. He also spoke to Leader Jeffries yesterday, and I think, you're going to continue to see him out there speaking to members, reassuring members. But, Mika, he's also the president of the United States. He cannot call all 535 members of Congress. So he's talking to leadership. He's talking to some members. He's doing what he can. He's talking to governors today. But, again, you're going to see him out on the campaign trail. You're going to see him at the White House. You're going to see him sit down with George Stephanopoulos. You're going to see him in key battleground states. He is making the rounds. He is traveling. He's doing what he needs to do to not only to reassure Americans, but also remind folks what is at stake in this election, how dangerous Donald Trump is to this country. And I got to say, Mika, first of all, where is Donald Trump? Haven't seen him much on the campaign trail in the last few days. Secondly, I'm just kind of, I don't want to say I'm tired of talking about this, but I think we got to get back to the fact that Donald Trump is a threat to the American people. We are dealing with a court system that is increasingly siding against the American people, that is increasingly making it far more dangerous if Donald Trump steps back in that White House. And there is one person, Mika, who is standing in the way of Donald Trump getting back in that White House, and that person is President Joe Biden.
Adrian, good morning. It's good to see you. So obviously the president, his inner circle, hears these calls now from one elected official, Democrat anyway, to step aside, from others around the political spectrum for him to get out. Is President Biden considering leaving the race?
No, you've heard this in his own words. He is not considering. He is the president of the United States. He is the person, the American people, Democrats who voted in all 50 states in the primary. That is who they want to be their nominee. He is the nominee for president of the United States, for the Democratic Party. We can't go against the will of the voters. He doesn't want to go against the will of the voters. Voters want to see him stay in this race. They want to see him fight. He is the person that they chose. He is the person that they know can best do the job, can best defeat Donald Trump. So, no, he's staying in this race, and he's going to continue to make that case, Willie, to the American people about what is at stake. I think it's just getting a little silly here that we're talking about one night in this presidential campaign where, yes, he had a bad night. But why are we letting that, continue to make the news about what's at stake in this race when really there is so much on the line for women? There is so much on the line for families across this country. Our economic freedoms are at risk if Donald Trump becomes president again. There would be a national abortion ban if Donald Trump becomes president again. There is a lot at stake here, and I think we got to get the focus back to talking about the issues that will define this race. What's at stake for the American people? I think President Biden is going to make these stakes very clear when he talks to George Stephanopoulos. The American people have a chance to see him, on television this weekend, making that case out on the campaign trail, out on the stump. And I think we got to just, kind of focus on what's really at stake here and focus on the issues that will drive voters and that drive their decisions in this election.
So, Adrian, for a moment, let's forget the political class. Let's forget the donor class. Let's forget the Acela corridor. How do you reassure, how does the president reassure just a regular Democratic voter, a regular independent voter who watched Thursday night and said, oof, I don't know if he's up for the job for another 4 years. And by the way, they might be saying, I like him. I voted for him. I know he beat Donald Trump, but that did not look to me like a man who's up to the job. How do you reassure that voter who wants to vote for Joe Biden but may now have some doubts?
Yeah, look, he's going to be, again, traveling to states. He's traveling to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania this weekend. He's going to make the case directly to voters. You're going to see him. North Carolina was such a powerful moment after the debate. It would have been a powerful moment regardless. You really saw him energetic, drawing that contrast, laying out the lies that Donald Trump told on the debate stage. You're going to see him do more of that. He's fantastic at drawing a contrast, especially when he's out there talking directly to the voters. So you're going to see a lot more of that. But, Willie, I also want to just underscore the fact, and we put out a polling memo from Jeff Guerin, one of our top pollsters, a couple days ago. Our results that came back from the polls from the debate show that not only was there no movement among voters, but there also a lot of independent voters had a lot of concerns with what they saw from Donald Trump, the lies that he told on that stage. I think it's really important that we got to keep in mind that, sure, President Biden made it clear, didn't have his best night, but Donald Trump didn't have a good night either. And the words that came out of Donald Trump's mouth were incredibly disturbing. The way he would govern, the way he would rule, the fact that he wants to be a dictator on day one. He's also made it clear, Willie, we've talked about this a lot, there would be a bloodbath, in Donald Trump's own words, if he does not win this election. So I think we got to get back to the issues that are going to drive voters' decisions. We've got to get back to drawing that contrast. That's what President Biden wants to do, and that's what you're going to see him do over the next few days, and certainly the next few weeks and months ahead.
All right, we'll be watching senior advisor and spokesperson for the Biden-Harris 2024 re-election campaign, Adrienne Elrod. Adrienne, thanks so much as always. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Willie.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.